Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. We will be going over two reports that Equilor recently came out with, the 2012 S&P 400 Mid-Cap and S&P 600 Small Cap CEO Pay Strategies. I am Aaron Boyd, the Director of Research here at Equilor, and I will be joined by Chris McGoldrick, a Senior Research Analyst who worked on this report. Just as a reminder to everyone, attendees will be receiving an email with the slide deck following the webinar, and slides and a recording of this webinar will be made available at equilor.com. With that said, let's jump into today's webinar. Looking at the agenda for today's webinar, we'll be going over a few issues. We'll look at the methodology with which we put together this report, and then talk about the CEO pay and the equity trends related to that pay. Both for, again, the mid-cap and the small-cap companies. We'll then look at the internal pay equity and the industry among the CEOs and the other executives at the firms. At the end, we will leave time for question and answer, as we'll have a discussion surrounding what exactly these numbers mean and answer any questions that listeners of today's webinar will have. So let's look at the methodology. For both of these reports, we looked at proxies filed between January 1st and April 30th of 2012. We then only included CEOs that were in place for 2 or more years. That way, when we were looking at change in pay information, we would be able to make sure that we eliminated both any severance figures for executives that left or any new hire grants for that would potentially skew information from one year to the next. For mid-cap companies, which you can see in green on the top, there were 289 CEOs that fit that criteria. For the small-cap companies, there were 444 CEOs. Now, looking at the performance of the different indices, just to give us some context around what was going on, both as far as performance was concerned and as well as what was going on in the economics and the marketplace, you can see that revenue and net income was up for both of them. But looking at market cap and really looking at considering the stock prices, the small cap companies actually saw their value decrease from 2010 to 2011, whereas mid cap went up just slightly at about 1.3%. Comparing this with large cap companies, which we had done earlier in the year, where their market cap was basically flat with approximately a 0.5% increase. You can see that small cap companies were far less successful than the mid cap companies in both revenue, income, and market cap. Comparing this to previous years, the small cap companies saw a lot greater success in 2009, but also struggled more during 2008. I think one of the common characteristics of the mid-cap is that they tend to be more moderate in terms of their changes in their performance year over year. With that stage set, let's move on to the actual CEO pay and look at the numbers that were involved with that. Looking at the change in pay over the last 3 years for both indices, you can see that, again, mid-cap did better in 2011 than the small-cap did, but if you go back to 2010, small-cap did much better. Again, looking at how the numbers shake up, you can see that the mid-cap is a bit more moderate in terms of changes than the small-cap companies, and again, small-cap saw actually saw a decrease in their pay in 2009. Again, these trends are very similar to what we're seeing with large cap companies who saw decreases in 2009 but saw over 20% increase in 2010, and in 2011 saw an approximate change of 6%. So again, small cap or mid cap tends to mirror what's going on with large cap a little bit closer, but the small cap companies do tend to have wider swings. I think a lot of that has to do with the companies being, the nature of the companies being smaller, being a lot more susceptible to market swings than potentially mid-cap and of course large-cap companies who have a more dominant market share and are able to have a little bit more static in terms of the movement of their stock price than some of the small cap companies, which are much more affected by external forces like economic circumstances, things in like the European Union, and as well as just the overall state of the economy, versus larger cap companies, which are obviously the dominant firms in their industries and in their products. Moving on to the pay components, you can see that really the driving factor in the changes in pay has to do with the equity portion of pay. You can see that stock was up 20% for mid-cap, over 35% for small-cap, while bonuses were slightly down for mid-cap and down more than 10% for the small-cap companies. This is very consistent with what we've seen with the larger companies. Again, as bonuses are coming back down to earth from the highs that we were seeing in 2010, and so where companies were exceeding their goals by quite a bit, I think a lot of which had to do with the recovery aspect in 2010 that really increased the number of bonuses, at least from a percentage standpoint. Again, going from potentially 0 bonuses, not receiving any bonuses in 2009, to receiving some bonuses, caused the overall bonus levels to jump pretty significantly. I think another factor also had to do with the goals. There was a lot more uncertainty surrounding goals and where we were going to be at the end of 2010, and so many goals were set very conservatively. And by the end of the year, when companies had rebounded quite effectively, you saw many CEOs exceed the targets that had been set for them on a cash basis by quite a bit, and so they saw some very large payouts. Now, comparing that to 2011, where people started to set more aggressive goals, and thus it was a little bit harder for CEOs to hit their goals, we saw those numbers come down a bit, and that's what you're seeing here in this graph. Moving over to the stock portion, you're seeing those pay components really affected by a recovering stock price for most companies. As we've seen the stock market increase pretty much across the board, you're seeing the value of awards given to executives who are, and we're measuring this using the grant date value. So measuring the value of the equity awards, the value of the restricted stock award on the day it was granted is up year over year. So again, thinking about where the stock market was at the beginning of 2011, which is when many of these grants were given, versus where it was at the beginning of 2010, we're able to see the values jump up pretty significantly, again, as these stock prices have gone up a bit. You'll notice over at the options, you've got a 0% change for small caps, and you see a pretty dramatic drop for options at reaching almost 70%. A lot of this has to do more with the structure of the equity grants that are being given to executives than it does the actual value of those awards. And we'll actually jump into that right now because equity is really the driving factor, and one of the largest portion of value for executives is being delivered through the use of equity. Looking at this next section for equity trends, you can see that the usage between the 3 types of equity vehicles, the stock option awards, the time-vested restricted stock, and then the performance shares, you can see that the use of performance shares is growing in popularity. Obviously, this doesn't have a time series on it, but as we've looked in the previous years, the number of companies that are using options have gone down, while the number that are using performance shares have gone up. Again, looking at the stock options explains the slide showing the values of options, where for small cap companies, they have less than a majority grant options. And so looking at the median value, the majority of companies don't grant any value to their options, which explains, and haven't done so for the last several years, which explains why there's no change in the overall value. For stock options, you can see that they're right on the cusp of having less than a majority of companies receive stock options for the first time in a very, very long time. Because it's getting down to to such a low level, it's getting to only the value of stock options are decreasing because we're looking really at the lowest level of option grants that companies are giving. I think looking at the trends, I expect next year we'll see even less people grant options, and thus we'll see that number go to 0 as less than a majority of companies are granting options. really where the value is being delivered is through full value shares, which comes in both restricted stock and performance shares. Again, companies are really starting to grant and distribute their equity through the use of the equity vehicle of performance shares as a way to hopefully tie pay to performance, and not through just staying around at a company like you'd get for restricted stock, which vests if you're able to stay at the company for a certain level of time, but also having to hit certain performance measurements that are included with those awards before any of those shares or any of that value is distributed. Again, you think small cap, far less likely to grant performance shares than the mid cap, and if you look at large cap, those companies are actually granting even more performance shares. So I think as time goes on, we're going to continue to see those grow in popularity as small cap companies start to catch up to the larger companies and their equity granting practices. If we look at the next slide, where we look at the breakdown in the use of the number of vehicles, and there's a lot going on here, so let me quickly explain what you're looking at. We looked at the breakdown between the number of vehicles being used to grant equity among both mid-cap and small-cap companies over the last 2 years, so both 2011 and 2010, to see what changes have gone on. You'll notice for the mid-cap companies, the number of companies using all three vehicles, so options, time-vested restricted stock, and performance shares, has gone up quite a bit, growing from 13 to 17% year over year. And a lot of that is done at the expense of those that were granting using only two vehicles. So again, you're seeing people who are moving away from just giving options and restricted stock to giving options, restricted stock, and then incorporating that performance share piece as well. You also notice that the number of companies not using any equity vehicles has gone up just very slightly from 2010, growing from about 7% to 8% among mid-cap companies. There's a bit of an anomaly because we've seen companies moving more and more of their equity granting practices, more of their pay practices to granting more equity and ensuring that as a portion of the pay. So that's a little odd, but overall the percentage change isn't actually that much. I think you also see an uptick in the number of companies that are granting one vehicle as opposed in 2011 versus 2010. You know, again, I think a lot of that has to do with companies that maybe granted both options and restricted stock and have moved away from the use of options. Looking at small cap companies, you'll notice pretty much the same trends as they're granting more equity in different types, multiple types of equity vehicles, as you see the increase in both in use of all three, going from about 9% in 2010 to about 11% in year over year. So, you know, I think we're seeing the same trend again as companies are moving away from the use of options, granting less of that, moving more towards performance shares, and either distributing the value and equity to either all three and reducing the amount to options, or just getting rid of options altogether. I think that's really the trend we're seeing. That's something we had seen among larger cap companies for many years, and I think as the mid and small cap companies are continuing to adjust their pay policies to adjust to the current environment of both say on pay and the real strong emphasis on pay for performance, you're going to continue to see companies make those adjustments, make those changes to their equity plans as they go about restructuring the types of equity that they're giving to their executives and how they're distributing values. And I think we'll continue to see more equity being distributed among more types of equity vehicles year over year. Now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Chris, as he's going to talk about the internal pay equity between CEOs and the other top executives in the firm.
Thanks, Aaron. So typically the pay given to chief executives usually will set the pace for other executives within his or her firm. But many companies, what they're increasingly becoming concerned about is their CEO's level of pay compared to other top executives within the company. So in looking at this trend, Equilar's reports examine the CEO's pay relative to the other 4 NEOs within the company. So what you'll see here on this slide is the median pay level for the top 5 executives at S&P 400 and S&P 600 companies. You can see that the median pay for mid-cap CEOs was just over $4 million, and the median pay for small-cap CEOs was just over $2 million. Just to give you an idea of how this compares to S&P 500 large cap, Aaron had said before that the median pay for 2012 was about $9 million. So there's a little bit of a difference there between the three indices. In terms of the differentiator, the largest differentiator between them was definitely the equity component. Mid-cap and small-cap CEOs both received equity awards that were valued at 2.5 times that of the second highest paid executive, and that compared to about 2.7 times what the S&P 500 CEOs got next to their number twos as an equity multiple. So equity was definitely the big differentiator between CEO pay and that of other named executive officers. So the next thing we'll take a look at is just pay multiple. So the CEO to number 2 pay multiple is just a measure of how much CEOs are paid relative to the second highest executive. And overall, you can see that this multiple was slightly higher at 2.2 for mid-cap companies than it was for small-cap companies at 1.9. And this trend pretty much stayed consistent throughout. As you can see, there were 2 exceptions, and those 2 exceptions were basic materials and technology, where small-cap CEOs had higher multiples than their counterparts in the S&P 400. We also broke this out in our reports between genders, and we saw similar results with multiples of 2.2 for females and 2.0 for males within the mid-cap, and then similar in the small-cap, 1.5 for females and 2.0 for males. But just to point out, because of the small number of female CEOs, the sample size isn't large enough to really provide any statistical support for this difference between genders, which is why it's not included in here. So the last thing we're going to take a look at today is industry. So we're going to see a breakdown of mid and small cap by industry. And we're going to take a look at first the year-to-year change in median total compensation within the S&P 400. So all industries saw an increase in median total compensation with the exception of utilities. Utilities saw a slight decrease, down 3.3% for the year. But the one thing that you'll probably notice stands out is the 35% increase in terms of pay for basic material CEOs. And one large component of this is oil companies that possibly saw larger annual incentive payouts for exceeding performance targets, as many might have benefited from the year-to-year increase in petroleum prices. That's one possibility. We also saw a large increase in basic material CEO median pay for the S&P 500. So now we'll take a look at the S&P 600, and as you can see, only 3 companies within the small cap index saw year-over-year increases in median compensation, while another 5 actually saw drops in median pay. Again, basic materials led all industries with a nearly 27% increase from 2010, benefiting from possibly the same reasons as their counterparts in the S&P 400. The year-over-year decrease in median pay for 5 of these industries may just be a correction from last year's relatively large median percentage increases following 2009, and it could be the result of more ambitious performance targets being set on the part of boards. The next slide contains industry portraits, where we've actually highlighted 3 industries in particular, those being healthcare, technology, and basic materials. It contains total CEO pay, age, tenure, as well as the percentage of CEOs that also serve as a director. So mid-cap healthcare CEOs, just like S&P 500 CEOs in the healthcare sector, have the highest median total pay at just over $6 million. And while technology CEOs saw a lower median pay than most industries except for utilities and financial services, tenure also tended to be higher within the technology sector at just about 9 years. And if we looked at this slide last year, we would have seen basic materials CEOs with a pay median of about $3.8 million. But as you can see, that increase in about 35% bumped up total pay for basic materials CEOs to just over $5.1 million. So definitely an increase there. So the last slide is in the same format, industry portraits highlighting healthcare, technology, and basic materials sectors for the S&P 600. So again, as you can see, healthcare CEOs were also the highest paid in the small cap index with nearly $3 million median pay for CEOs. Median tenure was also greater within the small cap for healthcare and basic materials CEOs. And this was a trend we definitely saw between the two indices. Tenure tended to be greater within the small cap index by about a year over the mid cap index. And lastly, while healthcare and technology CEOs, you can see, had 58 and 57% of CEOs serving on their own boards, basic materials CEOs, nearly 4 out of every 5 were serving on their boards. Thanks so much, and I'm going to hand it back over to Aaron. He's going to go over the summary points, and then we'll get started with the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. In summary, we want to just quickly go over the main points of this webinar. You'll see that, again, median CEO pay increased about 5.5% and 2.5% respectively among both the mid-cap and the small-cap companies. And a lot of that pay was really driven by the changes in the value of stock awards and the decrease in cash bonuses, which mitigated the increase that companies were seeing in the value of those awards. Companies also were granting more performance shares as they moved away from options, which has been a continuing trend for some time now. A lot of that stems, again, from the Sarbanes-Oxley rules and the expensing of options. But it's also moved away thanks to Say on Pay, as companies are looking to create a brighter line between the pay that they're giving their CEOs and the performance of the company and how those two are related. And finally, as Chris had mentioned in the industry portion, healthcare CEOs really do see the highest difference between their pay and the number 2 position, as they are also the highest paid executives among all the industries.
So let's get to some questions that we've had here regarding the presentation for today. The first question that we have surrounds pay equity. And basically what's being asked is that the pay equity values and the disconnect that's there is stemming from higher amounts of pay being given to CEOs through the use of equity, which is what's causing the balance shift. Do we see this becoming a problem for companies, or is this a positive development? I'm going to hand this question over to Chris, and he's going to be able to give some insights into this particular question.
Thanks, Aaron. In terms of internal pay equity, anytime we're talking about a disconnect or a disparity, I don't think calling it a positive development would be the term. But from a board's perspective, I definitely think it's something since Dodd-Frank that they're taking a little bit more notice of than they might have once been. While Dodd-Frank talked about the numerical relationship between the CEO's pay and that of the company's overall workforce or median employee pay, I think boards are a little bit more concerned with how their CEO is being compensated in regards to equity compared to those other named executive officers. Obviously, if you looked at just salary on an annual basis, I think most companies you'd see a multiple somewhere in the 1 to 3 range. It would be relatively low. But I think where boards are definitely getting concerned is if that multiple starts exploding and getting into somewhere in the 10 to 20, 20 to 30 range when you factor in equity. So I think it's definitely something that boards are a little bit more concerned with than they once were. I think, again, from a salary perspective, you're seeing pretty much internal pay equity. But when you factor in that equity component, that's when things might start to get a little out of hand with the multiple. So it's definitely something boards are looking at since Dodd-Frank. Obviously, it's not required, and I don't think you'll see it being disclosed more, but it is something to keep an eye on for sure.
Thanks, Chris. And he brings up the point of Dodd-Frank, which obviously has the CEO to median workers pay ratio rule, which the SEC is yet to rule on. But obviously that rule, which is not the same as internal pay equity, at least among executives, that rule has spurred discussions and has increased the amount that boards and companies are discussing internal pay equity as they're shifting to make sure that the balance between how much is being paid to their top officer and how much is being paid to the other executives is in line with what the company's philosophy is, and making sure that, like Chris said, that those numbers aren't getting out of alignment there. Another question that we have asks about pay growth among mid-cap, and basically it asks if we foresee another year where mid-cap CEO pay outgrows small-cap CEO pay over most of the industries. And I think that's a really tough question. I think if you look at how the companies have performed year to date, both for small-cap and mid-cap, they're pretty similar, and I think it's likely from a performance standpoint you're going to see the same. I think small cap B, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, does tend to have more extreme jumps because of the types of companies that they have. So we saw that in 2010 their pay was much higher, and in 2009 their pay was a lot lower, in fact negative, compared to mid-cap, which seemed to have a more moderate amount. So I think whenever you're seeing instances of change, you're more likely to see small-cap companies have more dramatic swings or larger swings, whether it's positive or negative. With that said, it being a relatively stable year, and what we've seen from large-cap companies, it appears again that pay is really not changing that much. Companies aren't looking to pay a lot more. You're not seeing companies grow exponentially, and at least most companies grow exponentially like we were seeing coming out of the recession. So really, I think as a cop-out answer, I think we're going to probably see them both be about the same. And I think it'll probably be, you'll see maybe a little growth, probably under 5% for both. It's yet to be seen. Obviously, we'll have to wait till the proxies come out next year. But I think from all indications, we're going to see very minimal growth, probably looking very, very flat for both small cap and mid cap. And so if one outpaces the other, it would probably be by a very small margin. I don't think you're going to see any negligible difference between both the small cap and the mid cap. And then lastly, we have one more question about internal pay equity that we're going to try and answer before we finish off the webinar here. And I'm going to give it back to Chris. But the question is regarding Dodd-Frank and about internal pay equity. And it talks about, it asks, how much do you think organization structure and culture will influence internal pay equity ratio? So I'm going to hand this back to Chris since he's our expert on internal pay equity, and let him take this one.
Thanks, Aaron. That's a good question. So in terms of structure and culture, I think there are a lot of factors that go into internal pay equity, and there's a lot of things that might affect what an appropriate internal pay equity ratio is at one company versus what's an appropriate internal pay equity ratio at another company. Some things you might take into consideration is the CEO externally hired versus other NEOs who might be internally hired. There you might expect a higher multiple. Other things that might affect it, is there a chief operating officer? If there's a chief operating officer, if there's an absence of a chief operating officer, that would definitely affect the internal pay equity ratio. And then number of CEOs over time might be something else that affects that ratio as well. If you're seeing a lot of CEOs over time at a certain company, you might expect that ratio also to be higher. Even from companies that have talked about or discussed or disclosed internal pay equity in the past, Intel's, DuPont's, GE's CEO Jeff Immelt recently called for more of its use. Even there you'll see a lot of variances between companies, so it's really tough to say that there's definitely a one-size-fits-all approach to internal pay equity. I think you're going to see a lot of differences between companies, and you can see that going forward as well, I think.
Thanks, Chris. And it looks like we're out of time here. I want to thank everybody for joining us and taking the time out of their day to listen in. For those of you who we did not get to your questions, we will make sure to follow up after the webinar. Again, as a reminder, you can download the slides at eqular.com/slides. You can also request a copy of both the mid-cap and small-cap CEO pay strategies reports. And of course, you can, for any other questions you might have, go ahead and email us at info@eqular.com. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and have a great day.